Warm reunion. Sometimes, even something like a demotion can be a good thing. Well, okay, it wasn't a demotion. Not exactly, but to me at the time, it might as well have been. The rain was coming down hard that evening, so hard that it was impossible to walk home without getting completely soaked through. I wasn't keen on dragging myself into my apartment looking like a sopping wet cat, so I decided to seek out shelter. I found it in the form of an empty bus stop. Holding my work bag over my head in a sorry attempt to shield it from the rain, I jogged over to the bus stop and sat with a deep sigh. How foolish I felt. This was my hometown. How had I forgotten how heavy it rained around this time of the year? I felt like a tourist. Well, I might as well have been. I hadn't been back home in nearly a decade. I'd moved to the big city to go to university and then start working as an accountant for a big company, all according to the vision my parents had for me. And then, without warning, I was transferred to a branch in my hometown, of all places. I still remembered the cold disappointment in my parents' voice when I told them over the phone. I had been back home for nearly 2 months at that point, and they hadn't even invited me to visit. So, yes, it might as well have been a demotion. I stared up at the dark sky as it wept. Perhaps I wanted to weep too, but my pride wouldn't allow it. Silently, I asked myself a question I had asked countless times. What exactly am I doing with my life? Well, there was an answer to that question. I was doing what I was told. From the moment I developed suitable cognitive abilities, my parents had drilled their expectations of me into my head. Excellence, Augustus, and nothing short of it. Their constant pressure on me made me strive to be the perfect academic machine. There had only been 2 complications, however. Much to their chagrin, I had ended up developing an interest in art, and I was good at it. Of course, they couldn't have their perfect son entertaining the idea of becoming anything but a hard-working employee of a respectable company, so I had been forbidden from drawing. Still, as most children do, I'd found ways to develop my skills in secret. And then, during my middle school years, a much more prominent distraction had arrived suddenly, and without warning, in the form of... My reminiscing was interrupted by the sounds of footsteps splashing in the puddles on the ground. I turned my head and spotted a young man jogging towards the same bus stop I was seated at. I gave a quiet sigh. A fellow tourist? Silently, I shifted to the opposite end of the bench and assumed the most closed-off position that I could. Hopefully, I would successfully pass across the message that I was not in the mood for a conversation. The man sat with a relieved sigh. Through my peripheral vision, I could see that he was cradling something bulky in his hands, and a quick glance at them revealed that it was a camera, an expensive-looking one at that. No wonder he ran here so fast. The rain could damage something like that. I should look away again, I thought, but I couldn't help myself. Even after I'd finally given up drawing for good, there were some habits I just couldn't beat, and one of them was the natural desire to observe people. It was much creepier when you didn't have a sketchbook in your hands, so I only did it fleetingly, but still. The man's fingers were long and slender, almost elegant even, if not for the chipping black polish on his nails. My gaze drifted upwards. The rain had soaked his band t-shirt, causing it to cling to his form and making the muscles underneath just a bit more obvious. Finally, I looked up at his face. He was still looking at his camera. This man had a beautiful side profile, objectively speaking. Deep olive skin, a sharp jawline, and a Nubian nose. Lashes that cast faint shadows over his slightly freckled cheeks. Loose, dark curls. My body grew tense. Quickly, I looked away. Another side effect of my years of my drawing was my inability to forget a face, especially one that I'd drawn before. As such, it only took a second for me to put a name to this one. He had changed a bit since the last time I'd seen him, but I could never forget his face. After all, he'd been the last person I ever drew. He had also been the bane of my existence for over 6 years. It was cold, but I could suddenly feel myself sweating. "Don't look this way," I silently pleaded, but I knew this man, and I knew that if there was one thing he couldn't do, it was minding his business. "Augie? Is that you?" Even that cursed nickname. I wanted to ignore him, but he was already shifting closer. leaning forward to get a good look at my face. I clenched my jaw and sat properly, turning to face him. His face had matured over the years. He had several new piercings, but it was him. 9 years ago, 1. Cole Rodrigo. 2. Augustus Xavier Franklin. His name sat on the top of that list, right above mine, as if mocking me. I clenched my fists hard, fingernails digging into the flesh of my palms. How many times did this make it? For the sake of my sanity, I'd stopped counting. How? How was it that someone so laid back, someone so carefree, did so excellently at school? Actually, I didn't care if he did well. I cared that he did better than me. I had always come top of my class every term, without fail. But that winning streak had ended the moment Cole transferred there in middle school. No matter how hard I tried, he would always beat me. Sometimes, by a single point. Irritated, I turned away from the list pinned to the notice board and immediately spotted him nearby. I walked over, steaming. "I don't even need to check it myself at this point," Cole said, hands casually tucked in his pockets. "All I have to do is take one look at your face, and I'll know whether I came out on top or not." He grinned at me, a dazzling grin that had all the girls smitten. All that grin did to me was make me even angrier. "You are infuriating," I hissed. He simply laughed in response. "That's only because you let me infuriate you, Augie. Things would be much easier for both of us if you simply accepted the fact that I'm smarter than you," he said. "Go to hell," I grumbled as I walked past him. He laughed again. My rivalry with Cole had been going on for years and was well known amongst both student and staff. The hardworking, straight-laced boy who always had his nose buried in a book versus the popular and handsome natural genius. The premise entertained quite a few people, but it didn't seem to entertain anyone more than it entertained Cole himself. I knew he didn't really see me as a rival and was just having fun with it. After all, how could you see someone who never beat you as a threat? I spent more time with Cole than with anyone else in high school, even though it was mostly to antagonize him. My parents were as obsessed with me beating him as I was, albeit for different reasons. More than anything, I wanted Cole to take me seriously. I couldn't stand being just a joke to him. And then, after the final examination of our final year in high school, a miracle occurred. 1. Augustus Xavier Franklin. 2. Cole Rodrigo. I was over the moon. I did it. I finally did it. I beat him, and it was at the exam that mattered more than anything. I rushed to find Cole. I couldn't wait to rub it in his face. I found him hanging around near the back of the school. "So you finally beat me, huh?" He hummed. "You've seen the list?" I asked, excitement buzzing through my entire body. I was finally going to get what I wanted the most. Some sort of negative reaction. Acknowledgement of my skills. Something. Anything other than that teasing smile. "I haven't. I don't need to. I've never seen you smile like that before," Cole responded. And he did give me something new, but it was the last thing I would have expected. What Cole gave me at that moment was a genuine sugar-sweet smile. "Congratulations, Augie." Even when I beat him, August never failed to take the wind right out of my sails. I immediately got the feeling of winning the battle, but losing the war. Cole and I walked home together that day. The town's beach was on the way, and we both stopped in front of it, gazing out into the ocean. Well, Cole did. I was watching him instead. His expression was satisfied and slightly thoughtful. The ocean breeze blew a lock of his curly hair out of place. It felt like I was truly seeing him for the first time. I wanted to know what he was thinking about, but I didn't have the courage to ask. From there, we said our goodbyes and went our separate ways after graduating. My parents discovered my art supplies and ordered me to stop drawing for good, insisting that it was a childish thing I should leave behind now that I was entering adulthood. I decided to listen to them, but before I threw out my art things, I drew one final picture. It was Cole, staring out at the sea with a serene expression on his face. Present, I hadn't heard a thing about Cole since I moved out of town. Despite all the time we'd spent together, I'd been too busy hating him to attempt getting any closer. Why was he here now? Had he even left at all in the first place? I see you've retained your bad habit of not minding the business that pays you, I said curtly, pushing my glasses up my nose. At once, Cole's face lit up in delight. It is you! He threw his head back and laughed. The sound was gratingly familiar. Oh my God, you haven't changed a bit. What's up, man? What have you been up to? Work, I answered plainly. It was the truth, after all. Yeah, that sounds about right. I see your stuffy suit and tie. What are you, an accountant? You were always good with numbers, Cole said, leaning back into his seat. That's right, I answered, slightly irritated by his accurate guess. I'd been dragged into a conversation against my will, and with Cole of all people. At once, I remembered all my parents' harsh words for never being able to beat him. I tried not to scowl. Hey, that's great. I always knew you'd do good with that head of yours. He chuckled with a grin that was, to my chagrin, very reminiscent of the one he'd given me all those years ago. This guy really hadn't changed at all, had he? He decided to further prove this by beginning to explain, unprompted, what he had been up to since we graduated from high school. He had attended a prestigious university with little trouble due to his stellar grades, but once he graduated, he went into photography instead. That got my parents really heated. He snickered. But they had to learn to deal with it eventually, especially since I'm doing pretty good now, financially speaking. I've got a few events to cover nearby, so I decided to use that opportunity to visit home. I nodded silently. I was experiencing the most disturbing sense of déjà vu. He would constantly go on and on like this back in high school, too. So, did you keep in touch with anyone from school? He asked, passing the conversation baton to me. Well, not really, I answered a bit awkwardly. I hadn't been close to anyone in high school, really, except for Cole, if he even counted. You? Cole shrugged. A few of them, yeah. Jake was my best friend, so of course we still talk. He got married last spring, actually. As he spoke, he began fiddling with his camera, switching it on. Other than him, I'd occasionally run into a few of our classmates. We'd talk and exchange contact info and promise to keep in touch. And then we wouldn't. He picked up his camera. With the exception of Lawrence, he and I dated for a bit. Say cheese. Click. Cole couldn't have chosen a worse moment to take a picture of me. Or a better one, depending on how you looked at the situation. There was no doubt that the surprise I felt at the sudden, casual reveal was showing on my face. Cole is gay? I remembered him getting a lot of female attention in school. I also remembered him being known as a heartbreaker. Even the prettiest, smartest, and most athletic girls never stood a chance with him. Even I had wondered why. I guess that explains it. Well, okay. He was gay. That wasn't a big deal. He revealed the fact so casually that I was sure it wasn't supposed to be a big deal, and then I noticed the amused expression on his face and realized he had caught me by surprise on purpose. So infuriating. Quickly collecting myself, I cleared my throat. Well, it's no wonder you two broke up if he's still anything like he was in high school. I don't think I've ever met a boy so unsanitary, I responded. Cole laughed. Yeah, he was pretty messy. Drove me nuts. I'm not really seeing anyone right now. What about you? You got a special someone? I cringed and looked away from him. I was hoping he wouldn't ask that question. Romance was sort of a sore spot for me, as it was yet another aspect of my life my parents tried to control. Well, no, I mumbled. My parents have tried to set me up with a few women, but they always find me too boring, unsurprisingly. The self-deprecating words left my mouth before I could even stop them. I frowned. Why the heck am I telling you this? Boring? The genuine surprise in Cole's voice made me look back at him. His brows were raised. You're not a boring man, don't say that. You're not bad looking, not as good looking as me or anything, but definitely not bad looking. And if we're talking about your personality, well, you certainly kept me entertained during our school years. He grinned, before casually adding, "You were the first guy I ever had a crush on, which definitely counts for something, I think." He paused suddenly, as if realizing what he had just said. And then, he snorted. "I wish I hadn't already taken a picture of you. Your face right now." He burst into laughter right as I blurted out, "What do you mean you had a crush on me?" Cole simply laughed harder. I felt my face grow prickly with heat. That explained it. That explained everything. Why our rivalry had never seemed that serious to him. Why he'd been so happy to see me happy when I finally beat him. Did I even actually beat him? Or had he just given me that final victory? Cole was still giggling. I grew frustrated. "Cole, this is serious," I huffed. "You can't just confess something like that without explaining anything." He managed to calm down, taking in deep breaths. He was still grinning from ear to ear. Right, sorry. I mean, there isn't much to explain, really. You know how weird crushes can be. They just show up, you know? We were in our second year of high school when I randomly realized that I like you. I'd probably liked you for longer than that, but just didn't notice, to be honest," he said. For the first time in years, I was experiencing genuine, hot-faced embarrassment. I covered my face, unsure of how to respond. It hadn't even been 10 minutes since we'd started talking, and he had already pulled the rug out from under my feet. Was this just in his nature? Eventually, I managed to recover my wits. He explained that his crush on me naturally faded away after we graduated, and he realized we probably wouldn't see each other for a while, if ever again. Eventually, he brought up my art. I tensed up again. "I stopped drawing," I explained tersely. Cole raised his brows. "Oh? Why? You used to be really good at it," he said. "My parents forbade me from art. It is a childish pursuit," I answered. Cole's nose scrunched up in disbelief. "They forbade you? Augie, you're an adult. They can't do anything to you now. You're grown and pay your own bills, I'm assuming. If you really aren't interested in art anymore, that's fine, but you were really good at it. You shouldn't just give up on it if you still have an interest in it." I was quiet as I turned his words over in my mind. He had a point. My parents would always mock me for my interest in art, but they couldn't control me anymore. But, as I thought, Cole made a soft noise of surprise. "Oh, the rain has stopped," he said. He stared at the sky for a moment, before looking back at me. "Hey, I've got to go. But think about what I said, okay? Let's keep in touch." We exchanged numbers, and he was gone. I sat there for a few minutes before getting up and finishing my commute back home. I sat in my small, empty apartment, staring at Cole's number on my phone. I could simply not contact him. I could ignore him if he tried to contact me. I could let him stay as a distant memory in the back of my mind, as my rival who really had never been a rival at all. Instead, I sent him a message, and it read, "Are you free tomorrow afternoon?" Cole and I began to spend time with each other following that evening. We would visit locations and walk around town, reminiscing about when we were boys. I realized I had never really known much about him. Well, it made sense. In my head back then, he had been nothing but an obstacle, a very smug, very annoying obstacle. However, as we met up physically and talked via texts, I found that he wasn't nearly as smug or full of himself as I had assumed when I was younger. He was actually rather reasonable. I found myself wondering quite often if we could have been friends if not for my parents' constant pressure on me. I wondered if we could still be friends despite their inevitable negative reaction to that sort of relationship with him. One day, while we were eating at a cafe I had gone to a lot as a teen, he brought up my art again. "So, have you thought about it?" he asked curiously. I had thought about it. I did still want to draw, but what would my parents think if they found out I had gone back to pursuing that passion? I was already something of a failure in their eyes due to being transferred back home. Wouldn't this just make that even worse? And yet, when I thought of putting a pencil to paper again, I felt excited. It made my fingers twitch in anticipation. Cole sighed softly. "All right, here's what we're gonna do. he started. "Today we're going to go and buy you new art supplies. Pencils, sketchbooks, the whole package. Then you're going to draw me something. And if you're not feeling it, you can just give them to me. They won't waste, so don't worry about that. You can't keep being afraid of what your parents think, okay? Life is too short for that." I wanted to argue, but he wasn't giving me much of a choice to do that. As soon as we had paid the bill, Cole was dragging me over to the only art store in town. I'd visited it a lot as a teenager. I wondered if the owner would remember me. When we got there, I could feel my hands grow sweaty from nervousness. I was sure that, somehow, my parents would see me in there. They'd be disappointed in me. As we stood in front of the door, I looked over at Cole and smiled nervously. "You first?" He sighed and shook his head. Stepping behind me, he placed his hands on my shoulders and gently pushed me into the store. As soon as I was inside, the nervousness melted off me like butter. I ended up spending an hour just browsing there. Walking between those shelves, I felt like a boy again. I remembered how this place had given me solace, away from my competition with Cole and my parents' pressure. And to my delight, the owner did recognize me. Once I'd bought my supplies, I went back outside, where Cole was patiently waiting for me at a bench on the sidewalk. He stood up, grinning. "There you go, there's that smile. I knew this would be good for you," he said. "We won't know that until I actually try drawing again. I probably suck at it now," I said, but I was happily clutching my supplies to my chest. To my surprise, he pulled out his phone and, before I could even protest, he took a picture of me. This was a habit of his. He seemed to enjoy taking pictures of people when they least expected it. "You know, you'd probably take better pictures if you warned people before you took them," I grumbled in complaint. "I beg to differ," Cole said. "People look their best when they're being their natural, authentic selves. Like right now, you're practically glowing." He put his phone away and set his hands on his hips. "Now then, Augie, draw me a picture." I led us to the beach, the last place we'd been together when we were younger. I had never given him the drawing I did of him back then, but I could draw him again now. Well, I would try. I had him stand and look at the sea again, just like he had looked that day. Drawing again felt a bit awkward at first, but I let myself get into it. I let myself get lost in the process instead of worrying about what the end process would be. And soon, my pencil was flying across the page as if it had a mind of its own. I finished after about 10 minutes. Then I held the book in front of me and really examined my work. "Sheesh, it's terrible," I cringed. "I'll be the judge of that," Cole said, taking the book from me and turning it to look at the drawing. He stared at it for several seconds, silent, and then he looked up at me again. "Augie, this is beautiful." He looked down at it, awed. "Seriously, it's like, wow. I remember you being good at drawing, but this is just fantastic." The genuine praise made me blush. "Well, it's yours. You can have it," I said, scratching the back of my neck, as my way of saying thank you. If you hadn't literally pushed me, even I probably never would have picked up a pencil again. So, thank you. Cole looked up from the drawing and smiled at me. It was that warm smile of his, the one that had done nothing but confuse me for years. Thinking back, that was probably the exact moment I started to really fall for him. Or maybe I had already fallen for him. Maybe I had liked him all the back in high school, which would explain why I had been so obsessed with him taking me seriously. I didn't know. All I knew was that at that moment, with the sea breeze gently tousling our hair, his smile made my heart swell with an inexplicable, unprecedented warmth. This was almost immediately followed by a cold shot of terror. What was that feeling? We had spent a couple of weeks in each other's company at this point, and I was ready to admit that I considered him a friend, but that sensation didn't feel like something one felt for a friend. I ignored it. I hoped it wouldn't come back. It did, several times. It had been 4 months since I'd gotten home, and 2 months since I'd reunited with Cole when my parents finally reached out to me again. My mother, speaking in her usual, clipped tone, decided to pretend like she and her husband hadn't just ignored my presence for several weeks and informed me over the phone that they would be coming to visit me that day. The problem with that was that as she spoke, Cole was in my kitchen rummaging through my fridge. He had come over the previous night with his PlayStation and had ended up sleeping over on the couch. It had taken every ounce of respectability to not invite him to sleep in my bed instead. I felt like such a fool, developing a crush on someone who had once liked me, especially since I didn't have the courage to tell him. I'd think about that later. As soon as the phone call was over, I cut Cole's search for breakfast short and sent him home. He was gone as soon as I explained my parents were coming over. I assumed they were coming over to lecture me. To my horror, they did more than just that. They let me know they intended on introducing me to another woman. "If you have to come back here, then you might as well start building a family," my father had said. When they left, I sat in my apartment for several minutes, thinking. I went to my bedroom and pulled out the sketchbook I had hidden under my pillow, just to make sure Cole never found it during one of his visits. I flipped through it. It was filled with drawings now, mostly of him. Over the weeks, he had quickly become my muse. I was still going to my soul-crushing 9-5 job every day, but things had become less gloomy. I could get through the day with a smile on my face, knowing that I'd be able to talk to Cole at the end of the day. I was truly happy, for the first time in years. But that fairy tale was over now. If I wanted to keep my parents in my life, I would have to live as they wanted me to. My gaze lingered on a drawing of Cole I'd done. He was asleep on my couch. Did I have to? Cole's words echoed in my head. "You can't keep being afraid of what your parents think, okay? Life is too short for that." I'd heard of people making sudden, spontaneous decisions that ended up changing their lives completely. I had never understood how someone could just do something like that. Until that very moment. I was filled with the sudden and spontaneous urge to do something drastic. Something that was probably stupid. Something that I felt in my heart that I needed to do. I was in love with Cole. I had no idea if he felt the same way about me, but even if he didn't, I couldn't keep living like this. The idea of going against my parents' wishes terrified me. Even as I entertained the idea, my mind was screaming at me to not even think about it. And so, I didn't. I stopped myself from thinking. I didn't give myself the chance to second-guess myself as I grabbed my phone and called Cole. "Come over. I need to talk to you. Now." I told Cole how I felt about him. I was thrilled when he held me and kissed me, telling me that his feelings for me had long since come back in full force. We began dating in secret, but we both knew that couldn't last long. Eventually, I came clean to my parents about everything. I had really hoped they would accept me, but they didn't. It wasn't surprising, but it was painful. They told me, quite plainly, that they couldn't have a son like me. It was a very conflicting time for me. On one hand, I was heartbroken. On the other hand, I felt truly free for the first time in my life. I quit my job and moved back to the city with Cole, living with him in his apartment. I got a job in retail and began pursuing my art seriously. It took several months, but after about a year of honing and improving my skills, my art career started to blossom, slowly but surely. Cole was there for me every step of the way, and when things got hard, when things seemed impossible, Cole would comfort me, offer support, and smile that sugar-sweet smile of his, and I'd know everything would be okay. And as long as I was with him, I knew everything would be. The end. How likely do you think it is for someone to meet their life partner in high school, considering how young people are in high school? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become part of our Rainbow Force and stay wholesome.